Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your time. I hope it is that you all can see me and hear me clearly. If at any point you have uh, any difficulties with the slides or perhaps in terms of seeing me or hearing me, please let me know. And both myself and the wonderful folks in teaching and learning will try to assist with this in some way if there's something that we can do on our end. Now, the talk that I have today is about critical learning in blended, critical reading, I should say, in blended learning settings. And it's about active learning in higher education, right? The way that the talk today is going to be structured is very simple. I will provide a brief introduction to what I want to say. I must preface that um, by stating this that the talk today is not an endorsement of a particular method as opposed to a broader approach to teaching and learning. And that's really what I want to talk about. So we will have an activity which is based on that particular approach to teaching and learning that I will discuss. Afterwards, I'll provide some more information in terms of trying to explain what it is that we do. It will be a quick 10-minute activity, and it would require us to form into breakout groups, of course. And then it is that we'll have an open discussion based on, your experience with the activity and the additional explanation. And then it is that we're going to have a wrap up, really. Now, with blended learning is something that existed before the pandemic, but it's much more commonplace today. That is without a doubt. So rather than have, a course or maybe an entire program fully online, it's far more common now than, let's say, perhaps 5 years before to have blended learning. So blended learning, in one sense, is part of the new normal. What I would say is that when it comes to blended learning settings, it helps us to think about different ways of engaging learners. It helps us to have the discussion on which approaches or technologies that may be best. But regardless of the different technologies that we use, I think it's a very helpful way for us to see these technologies as means and not solutions in and of themselves. Now, why have I said that? Because I think it's problematic to take a technology first approach to teaching and learning as though the technology has some sort of internal logic on its own, right? It still needs to be guided. It still needs us as educators to have some sense as to what exactly are we going to do with it. So we do need students who are capable, who are competent, and this is part of the reason why it is that we teach. This is part of the reason why we ourselves, we are learners as well. You can't teach unless it is that you're a continuous learner. And especially if it is that you're in the business of teaching and learning, you need to be a learner also. But shifting the focus back to our students and the ones that we are here to serve, we need students because, it's more than just helping it to get a job. Yes, that's very important. But the students that we teach are the ones that go on to form functional social institutions. So we think of the economy, we think of healthcare, we think of the media. We need students who would make up, different spheres of the societies that they're in. And, speaking specifically within the Vietnamese context, that is the case. Now, going back to some basics here in terms of education, we would be aware of Bloom's taxonomy. And the idea here in trying to foster critical and active learners is to get them to operate on the higher levels of the taxonomy rather than the lower levels, right? We want to get them away from being purely descriptive or get them away from low resolution thinking and try to foster an environment where it is that they would be, engaging in much more evaluation and synthesis and analysis. And there are many different ways in which this that we can go about fostering that. So the question that I'm pitching to you, and this is something that we can reflect on, is how exactly do we produce these type of learners? We want to see critical students, or we want students to be critical. We want them to be active and not passive. We want them, to be interested We want them to be self-regulated, and there are all kinds of adjacent terms and concepts that you find in education literature. But exactly how is it that we go about doing this? And I would say uh, critical reading is one particular method that can be used. And I'll talk about the method first before it is that I get into the framework that underpins this specific method. So we look at critical reading, and there's a lot of literature on critical reading and how it is connected towards creating active learners who communicate and co-construct and experiment and investigate and so on and so forth. This is the sort of thing that we really want to see. Now, this is premised on a particular paradigm, right? This paradigm of multiliteracies. Now, back in 1996, you had this group of educational scholars called the New London Group, and they advanced this particular idea of multiliteracies. It was actually based on an encounter that they had with each other in 1994, 2 years prior. And with the whole idea of multiliteracies, it has to do with acknowledging multiple modes of communication and meaning, in addition to cultural and linguistic diversity. And this is very much so something that characterizes the 21st century environment, especially as we are preparing learners to be 21st century learners, so to speak. So this is definitely something that I think really speaks to us here as a broad way of looking at what we do, regardless of the discipline, and disciplinarity is one thing to consider. The approach that we take to teaching and learning, it is to foster different forms of literacy at the end of the day. Literacy beyond just basic reading and writing. There's also literacy in terms of understanding their major, understanding the discipline of study that they're in. This is also something I would like to draw your attention to. Now, the whole idea of multiliteracies, it centers around four phases of teaching or four aspects of teaching. And this has to do with situated practice, explicit instruction, critical framing, and transformed practice, right? All of this stuff is in the literature. It's all good. It's great. And, from this broad paradigm of multiliteracies, I've developed a particular framework, right? I call it the ACGC framework. I'll explain it a bit later, which is much more task specific, I should say. And this is linked to the activity that we will be engaging in. So I want to just show some samples of the activity and describe it a little bit, because thinking about how it is that you can engage in this activity in blended settings, whether it be offline or online, there are certain standard features in terms of giving the learners access to readings, carefully curated reading material, giving very clear instructions in terms of what it is that they should do, in setting some expectations, placing a visible timer somewhere in the class if possible, right? Because it's an activity that works with time. Now, if it is that the students are offline, they sit in groups, they can form groups based on the tables that they're in. If it is that for any reason they are online and you're working with teams, especially, the breakout groups function is something that is particularly helpful. Or if it is that there is some other application that you may be using, like Collaborate Ultra or whatnot, that facilitates breakout groups, this works. In the case of offline classes, students can, respond to the readings, preferably in written form, right? They can do this either through the whiteboards that you may have in your classroom, or it is that you can have a Google form, Microsoft form, done up, so it is that they can use. If it is that they are online, they can respond via text, image, or voice. So it is that the way in which it is that they respond, it more or less kind of correspond with the different modalities of communication based on the setting that they are in. Now, these are just some samples of the activity, because this is something I've been doing. I've been trialing this for probably about a year and a half or so. And these are just some visuals here to show you, some of the stuff that students do in response to a reading, right? And we're going to engage in something like that ourselves. So here's the 10-minute activity that we're going to get into. I'm going to pull up the timer, and we're just going to split everybody up into breakout groups. And the idea here with this activity is this. So you can either scan the QR code or you can Google the title of the article. This is how it works. You read the article, you share your observations with those that you're in the group with. And when it is that we come back, you post your responses in the meeting chat section, or you can unmute your microphones and you can speak. Now, one guiding question to consider, and this activity here is a blend of two separate activities, that I modified for the sake of this talk here today, is looking at the definition of communication, a very simple definition of communication, looking at Harold Laswell's definition of communication. What would be, especially in the context of the article, what would be considered most important, right? Whether it is the who, the what, the which, the whom, or with what effect, right? So it's as simple as that. You read it, you share your initial thoughts, and you think about this particular activity from a communications perspective. This particular activity, again, because this that I teach in the professional communication program, this is one of the reasons why it is that I'm using this particular activity. But you can adapt the activities that you need to suit whatever purpose that you have and whatever major that you teach in. I want to talk a little bit more about the framework that kind of underpins this activity, right? And I want to talk about the ACGC framework, that I've worked on, and explain a little bit more about it, right? So the underlying premise here is that for students to develop competence in any area, right, they need practice. They need a learning environment, right? There needs to be a rationale, and their efforts need to be interpreted within a particular context. So with this activity, it is premised upon the ACGC framework, right? Activity, conditions, goal, context. So it means that in this case, setting the activity has to correspond with the conditions that you carry it out, the goals that you set for the activity, and the context, meaning that it has to be pitched at the right level. So in this case of the ACGC framework, learners are given a particular task, a reading task. In this particular case, as I mentioned, I often use journal articles. I give them instructions which would correspond with whether it's online or offline in terms of how they have to respond. And I also give them a sense of purpose for the activity. Now, sometimes I do this before. Other times I do it afterward, and after they engage with something that seems probably irrelevant to the class, I then explain why it is relevant to whatever the subject matter is that I'm focusing on for that particular day. And there's a particular measure of challenge that needs to be inherent in the reading. So I try to find things that are not just descriptive, but things that will truly challenge them in one way or the other. Now, going back to the whole idea of multiliteracies, right? Different forms of literacy, as we mentioned earlier in the talk. These are just some of the skills that they develop when it is that they engage in critical reading, again, premised on the framework. Okay, so they learn critical thinking, they learn research skills. In some cases, they have to go find a reading, depending on how the activity is modified, because this is something that you can modify, in any way that you choose. For all learners here who predominantly they are bilingual and English may not be their first language, it helps them to develop their language skills, their writing skills, especially if it is that they have to respond online or through a form, if it's something that's offline, or respond on the whiteboards with visualizations and stuff like that. It also helps them with their layout skills and their organizational skills and that sort of thing, right? These are just some of the skills that they develop, and I try to let students understand that, right? Now, I want to open up the floor a little bit, for any sort of questions, comments, maybe critiques regarding the activity, or any questions regarding the framework that underpins the activity, or anything like that. So the floor is open now for any questions or comments that anyone would have. And, we have some time to, get into a discussion here on what I've presented. So The floor is open, everyone.